Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are talking about the dark side of the winter holiday season. It hasn't always been what you imagine. The Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or about any podcast platform.
Now, what makes a good winter story? We have celebrations, we have joy, we have presents, maybe even just forgetting the world all around you and this Yuletide bliss.
Wait, where are the phantom huntsmen, the fairies, spectral animals, and ghosts?
Well, that is the other side of the holiday season, and it is a constant reminder that on this other side, there is evil that is not as far away as we pretend, even during the joyous holiday season.
Thank you to everyone who came out to the Dark Ozarks live events over the past few weeks. More are coming after the first of the year. Find details for events at paranormalsciencelab.com. And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
What are the noir traditions of this time of year?
That is a surprisingly wide-ranging list that we don't often partake in these days, except maybe an occasional Christmas Carol TV movie. But that is only a small part of dark Christmas and Yule lore. What is the grandest theme of this time of the year, in your opinion?
I really have to say it is the wild host or the wild hunt. But so let's start there. As soon as we give a shout out to our great sponsors who help us bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
We encourage everyone to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and their website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more, not to mention the building's haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, the building's also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Okay, the wild hunt. You know, a lot of people may not really be familiar with the hunt or where it really comes from, although they've probably seen images of it.
Quite possibly, or they've been exposed to folkloric elements or descendant lore associated with the wild hunt or the wild host. And so in short, first of all, it is very specifically Northern European folklore. It is a folkloric motif. So it covers a really, it has many facets, but in short, it is a chase through the sky led by a mythic figure associated or followed by ghostly and supernatural hunters. And the mythic figure in question changes from region to region, but is most often Odin.
Yes, basically a supernatural being, typically all powerful, with the ability to mete out destiny to mortals, basically.
So in short, Anthony Hopkins.
There you go. You know, and before we get into, you know, some of the other kind of modern connotations of this motif, you know, one thing that people may not really associate, it comes up in Westerns, it comes up in music, you know, Riders in the Sky. To be perfectly honest, the motif goes clear back to this.
It probably wouldn't come as a huge surprise to anyone that as a child, and I'm talking ages 6 to 9, my two favorite songs was one, Ghost Riders in the Sky by Sons of the Pioneers, and two, Sink the Bismarck by Johnny Horton.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Battle of New Orleans and Comanche the War Horse were right in there. But Riders in the Sky, of course, it is a great cowboy song, and we recognize it as a really a folkloric motif of the Old West, but it is a retelling of the Wild Host.
It is. And if anyone's confused why we're using the Wild Host, it's just basically another word for the Wild Hunt.
It is, and it's reference to the host of supernatural beings that are following along as essentially supernatural hunters, which when you say that is extra creepy.
It is, especially for those who, theoretically would view this. And it was not just limited to Scandinavia. It took on connotations throughout Northern Europe and Germanic culture in the British Isles. And it gets, just really interesting. I think it's really interesting that it'd be easy to say that, people just view this as a parable or, a cautionary tale of be good, which, I mean, if you want to be literal when we talk about Christmas and, talking about be good or, Santa Claus isn't going to give you presents and everything, it kind of goes back to this idea that there are dangers in the winter and things can happen to you. But a real life example of where people invoked the Wild Hunt as a omen of bad tidings was put down in the Peterborough Chronicle in 1127, basically giving an account that shortly after basically a very disastrous abbot was named for the monastery, Henry d'Angeli, that everyone, men in the area saw the hunt come through. And with quite a bit of detail that they were, the huntsmen were black, huge, hideous, rode black horses on black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black with eyes like saucers. It was seen throughout the town and all through the woods around, and the knights heard them sounding and winding their horns. So it was used not just as a parable, but as a sort of a omen for real world tidings as well, which I find that interesting.
I do too. Something that's particularly interesting to me about the Peterborough Chronicle account is that it is written not as a folkloric motif, but as something that's actually being recorded as part of recorded history.
Yes, that, and I think that basically the idea, and of course, when you look at that time period and everything, that, deeds could have very far-reaching effects, and that basically by making a bad decision, they had brought disaster upon themselves, not only by, maybe mismanagement of the abbey, but perhaps destruction of them all, because this wasn't just something that you would view riding across the sky. It could have implications for you. They could steal your spirit. There were death omens. It could mark just dire times.
And as is the case with a lot of these supernatural elements, there is a good and a bad existing simultaneously. We've gotten, first of all, things like the modern idea of an association with the medieval wild hunt legends associated with the witch's Sabbath, that it is also a death omen, that it is an omen for the community, as we referenced with the Peterborough Chronicle. Something that's, I remember from a little while back in terms of doing earlier research, I found really interesting is that the wild hunt, obviously they're hunting. It's a hunting party. That's a larger concept there. But it is the idea that they're hunting souls, and specifically the souls of the dead. Something that I was deeply interested in, this idea. It's maybe a little odd, but there was a belief that the souls of the dead would wander unrequited until the Yule season, at which point the wild hunt would come through and collect the dead. That's who they were hunting, and they would take the newly dead with them to the underworld or the other world, or there was an invitation to join the hunt, which of course we hear echoed in the refrains of Ghost Riders in the Sky.
Yes. And and if to be honest, then you have to see parallel too of the hunt collecting the souls of the dead, similar to the ferryman collecting the dead and taking them to the underworld.
There is that
there's an accompaniment. There's a escort of sorts.
Yes, and within that framework, depending upon one's perspective, certain aspects of that are not negative.
No. I think one thing that we see quite often when we are talking with groups and talk about the subject of the paranormal, there seems to be quite a fear, or at least a very unsettled feeling of modern people with the idea of the stuck dead, the dead who are on this side, and aren't they supposed to do something, go somewhere. And I think, to be honest, part of that may be sort of an ancestral memory of all of these tales that the dead are escorted somewhere. So if they aren't, is there something wrong? And perhaps that is that sort of that primal unsettling feeling that goes up the back of your neck, or at least for some people with that idea.
And that brings up this larger conceptual view of the supernatural, of the paranormal in these situations, in which the more compliant dead would essentially be nice and go on their way, and the less compliant, less neighborly dead might resist the wild hunt and stick around for mischief or malevolence.
That's true. So we might freak out a few more people there.
What this is really telling us is that post-modernity, in its attempt to banish Odin and the wild hunt, is actually just creating so many problems in the in-between spaces that it's really time that we reinvoked the host to come and basically clean up our mess for us.
That's right. There's we're creating a state of anxiety in the veil and the void. So that we have dead.
Right. This is not the sort of nocturnal spookiness that I'm really trying to invoke, but there is a little bit in the back of my mind that sees the supernatural wild hunt scouring the countryside, essentially just like a giant vacuum cleaner, hoovering up the unrequited dead who are just sort of wandering around aimlessly going, why am I here? And they finally come along and say, hey, we'll take you to the other world. It's all good. We'll give you a purpose. We'll show you the way. It's wintertime. You're cold. You're tired. You're confused. Just come with us. Hey, look, we even have a he goat for you to ride on. It's great.
Although in some versions, what they're riding are demon horses and so forth. So you have to keep it.
Yeah. So, there is definitely an unseelie court quality to the Wild Hunt.
Oh, yeah, I do think that there is a similarity, and perhaps over time one influenced the other, and vice versa.
I think that's very, very reasonable, and I'm deeply interested. We see this with elves. We see this with fairies. That there is a strong conflation between spirits of the dead and the elves, spirits of the dead and the fairies, and to me that's fascinating because, again, with our desire to put everything into neat, tidy boxes, we place them in very separate categories.
Yeah, we tend to do that. I don't know whether, it just, that disassociation of things just, maybe it just makes it a little easier. I'm not sure.
And it does, it is the sort of the Christmas elf motif, obviously. In our minds, the Coca-Cola Santa Claus, the little Christmas elves working away in the toy shop, to more modern versions. We have the Keebler elves toiling away to bake cookies. We have Hermie, the dentist elf, on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This, in its modern or postmodern retelling, is far removed from a watchful ancestor spirit who becomes corporeal, for better or for worse. And in this case, the elves, maybe alongside the Valkyrie, maybe alongside the Fae, and in many cases with this host strongly resembles, as I mentioned, the unseelie court. And for those who are unfamiliar with that, the traditional Irish view that was documented by W.B. Yeats around 1890 implies that there is a light court and a dark court, a high court and a low court of the fairies, and both of them can cause considerable trouble for mortals. But the Seelie court, the high Seelie court, is made of these beautiful, almost angelic beings with great power, definitely similar to Tolkien's elven race.
Yeah.
And though with more shape-shifting and issues. But the Unseelie court, which is associated with the Fomorians, the evil underworld. Evil is a relative term in Celtic mythology, but they are beings that are often grotesque. They are phantom-like. They are regularly very frightening, and they are typically associated with death and the Celtic gods of death. They bathe the Morrigan, and one of, I think, probably my personal favorite, which is an interesting crossover, is the death coach, the Coshtavar, and the Dullahan, the headless driver. And certainly the aspects of the death coach have strong 16th, 17th, and 18th century elements to it. We're not talking about pre-Christian Ireland in the Coshtavar, but there is it is a spectral night ride. It is coming to claim the dead. It is a death omen, and it is associated with fate.
Well, and again, and as you said, it draws from the hunt. And I think when you talk about present day just connotations, many people have a bit of an aversion to a hearse, even if it's
Yes.
not in a funeral procession. And I think it goes back to, 1,000 years or more of tales of belief that dark coach coming to get you, that really ties all the way back to the hunt and to the ferryman. And I just think it's something that is very primal and deep seated in our psyche as human beings.
Definitely is. It's again those motifs that we recognize. We can
Yes.
recognize them as children. We can recognize them as adults. We don't need the explanatory. We don't need subtitles to understand the imagery of it. And even very simplistic at times presentations of it resonate. They resonate a lot. The Kushtavar is represented in Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Much more recently, in a mid, I'm trying to remember the season on Supernatural, Death arrives in a black vintage Cadillac.
Actually, it's dark gray.
Dark gray, yeah.
But it's the same. But it is based on that. Yes.
Yeah, it just has that. You know what it is that you're seeing, even if you don't know what it is that you're seeing.
Mm-hmm. That just gives you that ominous feeling. And then you mentioned not having to be children to figure it out. Even the Grimm brothers get involved in the retellings,
which I do appreciate. I really do. From what we can tell, the Wild Hunt was first officially documented in 1835 by Jacob Grimm in association with traditional Germanic tales. And there is a heavy German element. We see Berchta, the Winter Witch, associated with this. And something else that I found really, really interesting. First of all, that historian Ronald Hutton noted that there was, quote, a powerful and well-established international scholarly tradition, which argued that the medieval wild hunt legends were an influence on the development of the early modern ideas of the witch's Sabbath. And I think certainly the flying through the air could be a part of that. The inclusion of the Valkyries and the fairies, I think, is really, really interesting, as well as an earlier aspect of the hunt, which comes back to Grimm, arguing that the phenomena obviously has pre-Christian origins, and that the male figure who appeared in it was a survival of folk beliefs about Odin or Woden, which I don't think is a huge leap to make, but that sometimes he was replaced by Hulda or Berchta. And so you have a male and female, a god and a goddess, duality holding these places. And I think that's something that the modern retelling of the Wild Hunt is often lost.
That's true. That is true. And certainly that aspect is not present in Ghost Riders in the Sky.
No. And of course, as the society became more influenced by the church, Odin and many of these other characters simply get replaced with the devil.
The devil, Herod, Cain.
Yes.
So basically anyone that fell on the bad side in the Bible.
Right.
But but it's interesting though that though the church attempted to do that, that is not how it was characterized by in the Peterborough Chronicle, and even the first written, documentation from the Grimm brothers doesn't cast it in that light, really.
True. It's certainly there's a death omen or an omen of sorts that is often associated, but something that we see in terms of a larger, perhaps more interesting perspective in these things, to me anyway, as interpretation, is that things like the Wild Hunt are oftentimes being observed as simply are. There is a fate element associated, but less of a the devil's going to get you, and much more of a this is a thing.
And it's the way of the world.
That there's elements, and of course that this way may be terrifying, but it is what it is.
And by the same aspect that there is some order to it and predictability, perhaps.
I think that is pretty fair in that regard. I like something that I found really interesting was, perhaps not surprisingly, the Welsh element of this, with Gwyneth Nuth and the Tawlith tech. The character of Gwyneth Nuth, he is often in Welsh lore. Gwyn ap Nuth is the Odin or Odin-esque figure. The wild huntsman riding a demon horse, hunting souls at night with a pack of white-bodied and red-eared dogs of hell. I just like saying that because it's cool. But if you reference, and this is to me a very interesting aspect of this, if you reference the Cúna the Hounds of Annuin, certainly a part of it, you can't help but make some reference to Cucuven or Cuchulainn, the Hound, but and the Morrigan. But there's a great story in the Mabinogion in which Pwyll, who is our hero, is out hunting, and his pack of dogs, and he's on his horse, and he encounters another pack of dogs that have taken down a stag, and his pack of dogs runs off the other dogs, which is not a good idea to do. But the other pack of dogs they shine with a golden sheen, and they have red tipped ears that are incredibly notable and beautiful. And that is the only indicator that Pwyll has ridden into the other world. And then the king of the other world, Annabin, comes and challenges Pwyll, and there's a bit of a face-off. But instead of the story of demon hounds and your collective other underworld darkness, because Annabin is associated with the Horned King, and this is also associated with Cernunnos, so we do have that crossover. And it is of course a big part of Welsh legend. Now, if you were to, watch The Black Cauldron when you're 6 and burst into tears halfway through because you were so scared, not that would have been me, that the Horned King, voiced by John Hurt, is this terrifying demonic figure. And I am particularly intrigued by the fact that if you go back to the Mabinogion, the Horned King, or Annabin, is an incredibly positive figure who has great shape-shifting magic, has some issues that he needs a little help with, similar to some Arthurian legends, and strikes up a bargain with Poole and says, hey, let's trade places for a year. I will use my shape-shifting magic on you. You will look and sound exactly like me. Get back to my magnificent kingdom in the other world, not an underworld, but an other world. Rule my kingdom for 12 months. I will turn myself into looking just like you. We'll reconvene in 12 months and see how things are. And lo and behold, it has a happy ending, and Poole and Annabin end up being friends.
Well, that's a little different twist than they took with the Arthur legend, which
it is, to me, I think it's fun, and I'm still a bit scarred by the Black Cauldron, but that's neither here nor there.
Fair. I like the Cornish version of the Wild Hunt with the Devil's Dandy Dogs.
I am fascinated by the Devil's Dandy Dogs. Now tell me what really jumped out to you about those.
I think for me that because it really incorporates belief about a demon or the devil thrown in with fairies, and then you have the pack of dogs, and I like the twist that the herdsman is saved by kneeling and praying, and that saved him from the pack. And of course that draws on Catholic dogma, and but I just find it as an interesting twist.
It is. And
what did you like about it, or dislike? Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, certainly nothing to dislike. I find all of it fascinating. I'm very interested in Cornish lore. We're specifically referencing Cornwall, the southwestern peninsula of modern day England. And when the Anglo-Saxons invaded Roman Britain, essentially the Welsh, though they wouldn't have been called Welsh at that time, the Celtic, the Romanized Celts who were living throughout the south of England were ultimately, through a series of conflicts, were pushed westward into modern day Wales and modern day Cornwall. And so this is how the languages of the dialects of Welsh, as well as the language of Cornish, came to be, separate from what ultimately developed into English over several hundred years. But both of these areas are associated with mystical happenings. They're associated with the Fae. They are associated with Merlin and a variety of Arthurian legends, and they're associated with the Druids. And so consequently, any of the bits and pieces of lore that I pick up on either Welsh, Manx, or Cornwall, all of it is Cornish, is vastly interesting to me. What for me really jumped out is, again, this interesting duality. The Cornish devil dogs hunt human souls. Then again, sometimes they seem to prey on witches, but then there's a Scandinavian legend associated with this. Also, there is a connotation with Odin. And then in some of this, it is the elf, in some cases, it is the elf women, or it is the witches who are being hunted by these things.
Exactly. And you have to wonder if the variations came about by different political or societal conditions at a particular time.
I think that certainly has elements to it. The other thing that it really made me think about is that, for example, mm, many of the things, traditional, particularly wild crafting, plants, herbs, use of things like hawthorn, etc. You can look up compendiums that say this is what the witches use, so beware. And then you look up other things that say these same things are how you keep the witches away, so protect yourself with it. And I find that innate conflict to just be vastly interesting. And it speaks to a mindset and a perspective that is very different than ours, in the idea that on the question of, is it this way or is it that way, the best educated response is to look you square in the eye and say, yes.
Which is often the answer in these matters.
And again, a modern or postmodern perspective says that doesn't make any sense. But from an earlier standpoint, it usually did make sense.
Exactly. You saying that from the modern perspective made me think that it might surprise some people who, particularly people who go to certain concerts, that the sign of the devil's horns actually comes to play in this.
Yes.
It's not invented in the 60s.
No, it is not. And the idea that in some parts of Europe, making the devil's horns is actually a way to protect yourself from evil, and more specifically, protect yourself from the devil.
And specifically, still considered more effective in doing so than making the sign of the cross.
And I am either delighted or dismayed about the fact that the devil's horns are also called the horns of Cernunnos.
Yes. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just the terminology that gets changed over time.
It is.
It was in the Middle Ages that things got screwed up.
Yeah.
That's what they decided. It was actually an appeal to the devil.
Monolithic authoritarianism. So, it is one of those things. Of course, many people would be surprised to realize that in actual scripture accounts, there is no reference to the devil having horns, or a pitchfork, or a forked tail, or any of those things. And there is conflation from Greco-Roman, as well as a variety of Northern European religious iconography that associated some of these elements with the devil. From the Greco-Roman, certainly Pan is a big part, plays a very big role. And Cernunnos, in a bit more esoteric circles, Cernunnos plays a much larger role. And Pan probably gets the reference with the ram's horns, and more of the actual horns. I'm just absolutely spitballing here, but we did have the cult of Mithras, which was heavily associated with bulls and bull horns. And so I think that there might be some causal relationship there. But the reference to Cernunnos I find unique in the fact that Cernunnos does not have horns.
That's true.
Cernunnos is a forest god with antlers.
Mhm.
And I would argue that traditionalist people living in Europe would really know the difference between one and the other.
I think that's a fair statement.
Of course, I'm a huge fan. I fanboy about Cornunos and occasionally cosplay as Cornunos. So that is a thing.
But it's also when people uh, the Devil's Horns have gotten a lot of pop culture reference and everything, but it's also, when you think it, no different than the Fist of Thor, which was used as protection and a sign against evil as well. So it's very similar. And 1,000 years ago, people would have known exactly what you were intending.
Which to me is strangely comforting in an odd sort of way. In a continuation just of the Wild Hunt, you can't help but associate the hunt with the season. The fact that this is the coldest, the darkest part of the year. We are talking about a time of potentially ferocious winds, of blizzards howling across the land. And to me, it's very frightening. It is very beautiful. It is very thought-provoking that if you were to find yourself out in these storms, that would be the time when you would see this ghostly procession.
That's true. Perhaps as you're freezing to death.
Right. Or especially as you're freezing to death. It's pretty much the equivalent of for the Wild Hunt, you freezing to death in the blizzard is the equivalent of the McDonald's fast food window. You're just
as they roll through and snatch your soul.
Yes. But that, and along with that is, whether it's Odin, whether it's Berkta, whether it's someone else, what we're essentially implying is that there's an ancient god of the dead who's riding through the night sky.
Exactly. And usually associated with dogs and or horses, which are both traditionally were associated with death, among other things, but they both were seen as associated with death or death omens.
It is, and certainly the horse shrines of Celtic Europe echo this. The wearing of animal heads, even the Mari Lwyd of Welsh lore at this time of year has strong associated connotations. And I also find it interesting. I can't talk tonight. I find that
you might mention, for people who aren't aware, we are talking about a skeleton horse.
Yes, the Mari Lwyd is a very, very old Welsh tradition during the Christmas season, in which a singing skeleton horse trick or treats from door to door asking for booze.
I like it.
I'm very, very, very tempted to do this. There's really no aspect of the Mari Lwyd that I do not find appealing.
Your neighbors might, though.
It's either a good way for me to get drunk or get shot, depending on where I go.
That's true. Proceed with caution.
No tradition like an old tradition. It's the trick is
Oh, go ahead.
the trick is to enlist several heralds with historical notes of explanation.
Okay.
Preferably for them to canvass the neighborhood several times in the preceding weeks. Actually, at this point, those cute little printed door hangers, I'm probably going to invest in those with a little skeletal horse with the big eyes and say, FYI, the countdown has begun. Stock up on some beer. The skeletal singing horse is coming to a neighborhood near you.
I'm not sure how you went down that rabbit hole, but okay.
My primary takeaway on this Thanksgiving Eve is I'm really, really smart and I'm not quite right in the head.
And you want an argument with that?
Not at all.
Well, since we're talking about tradition, I guess we could talk about Old Christmas as opposed to New Christmas.
I love Old Christmas. For people who don't know, Old Christmas is Epiphany. It is January 6th. If you come from a more Catholic tradition, you will recognize Epiphany. And it is a holy day in Christendom that is today forgotten largely forgotten in lands that were heavily impacted by the Protestant Reformation, but are still remembered and observed in Catholic Christian nations across the world. And it is the day of the evening of the wise men in Spain, and it has reputed magical qualities. And for example, Spain and Italy. I love the Dia de los Reyes and Magos, the evening that the three kings will visit and leave candy in your shoes in Spain and Portugal. It also, if memory serves,
you wonder if they were drunk, and that's why it started by putting it in your shoes.
The shoes were there. I particularly love the phrasing in Spanish, Reyes and Magos, the magic kings, or the kings who are magi.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, really liked that the verbal imagery that is created, something that is a lot more evocative than the wise men.
Yeah.
That we have with the English translation. And it is fair to say that the wise men, the magi, were likely of a Zoroastrian religion from modern day Persia. And of course, Zoroastrianism has some really interesting mythology unto itself, and and some very powerful reading of the signs, which of course is included in scripture, that I find really beautiful. Then Italy, if memory serves, Befana, the witch, is associated with January 6th as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe so. But for those of wondering why January 6th and why December 25th, it's basically because we changed calendars.
Yes, and not everyone got the memo.
Well, it took several hundred years for everyone to catch up.
And so what we have is that January 6th, or Old Christmas. When we say Old Christmas, we literally do mean Old Christmas. because it was the late 1500s when Pope Gregory the 13th changed the calendar to match the solar cycle more closely, and in so doing, the Julian calendar had to be reduced from 376 days to 365 days, eliminating 11 full days. Some countries, we're looking at you, England and Scotland, resisted the change and kept the old calendar for about 200 years. And the adoption of the Gregorian calendar did not take place until 1752, which is really kind of crazy when you realize how late in the early modern era.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, when you think about it, there were events happening in North America in the English colonies that technically happened under a different calendar.
Yes. And what is, to me anyway, just incredibly fascinating is that from, say, like the 1580s to the 1750s, this is a time when there was an enormous amount of colonization, European and specifically English and Scottish settlers moving into Appalachia, which this is going to figure predominantly, but moving into Appalachia. And they went into the hills with one calendar and the rest of the world changed while they weren't looking.
That's right. And as a result, they still celebrate Old Christmas quite heavily.
And Old Christmas, there is, as certainly is noted with the arrival of the Magi, the witch Befana, the Italian witch Befana, but also a lot of unique lore surrounds Old Christmas in North America. And this is tying directly into the Ozarks as well as Appalachia. Many of those Scots, Irish, and English settlers who ended up in Appalachia and ultimately ended up in the Ozarks would have still been using the Gregorian calendar, and they brought with them a surprising amount of lore associated with Old Christmas, with January 6th, that I find really fascinating. And what I also find perhaps unsurprising, but really cool, is that the Appalachian lore is nearly identical to the Ozarkian lore.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think because a lot of the settlers went to Appalachia and then came straight here then, and so you have a continuity there.
You do. And things like dumb suppers, the idea of going out to the barnyard and having the animals bow down in reverence to the nativity. Those things in particular, there's lore associated with finding green growing plants out of place on January 6th. There's just some really, really interesting aspects. And then coming back to the Mari Lloyd, is that mumming, the traditional English mummers dances, which was like trick-or-treating for grown-ups, but not on Halloween, which was quite common, and is interestingly enough memorialized by Lorena McKinnott's The Mummer's Dance from her Book of Secrets album, which I wouldn't happen to have practically memorized at this point. It was called, an Appalachian tradition was called serenading, and essentially going from house to house, visiting, singing, storytelling, dancing. Guns were often fired, bonfires were set to ward off evil spirits. This sounds like a lot of other things in European tradition, in European folk tradition.
It does, for different purposes, different times of the year, etc., and even a little bit of continuity with Wild Hunt.
Very, very true. And for individuals who are unfamiliar with mumming, you do dress up for that, oftentimes in very grotesque folk masks,
Gee, I mean,
which for the record also sounds like a lot of fun.
mhm.
Um,
Let's see.
for what here is my declaration for the coming new year. If I cannot procure or I happen to misplace my phantom horse's skull, I'll just find a bunch of corn husks and go with a more traditional mumming style.
Okay, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Sometimes my reputation does not precede me.
I just know you pretty well.
I know, it's probably a good thing. Josh keeps everyone around him on their toes by sometimes being surprisingly normal. Sort of. Anyway, and one of the things actually that this reminds me a little bit of the Italian tradition, and in this case it is Irish, but I think it's really beautiful, and it does still have some traditions in the South, in the South of the United States, but that of simply placing a lighted candle in the window on Christmas Eve to welcome Mary and Joseph as they search for a place to have their baby and take shelter.
Mm-hmm. You do still see that.
And I think that's really beautiful.
We can also thank Old Christmas for things like fruitcake.
Hey, I'm good with that. I will take a season of bulking, and I'll just eat my way through all the fruitcake that nobody else wants.
There you go, and mincemeat as well.
And I love.
I like mincemeat myself.
I love mincemeat. Love mincemeat pie, traditional mincemeat as well. And for the record, I also love fruitcake. That probably will not surprise people. Now, again, a lot of these, when we look at things like the Mari Lloyd, when we look at the wild host or the wild hunt, the spectral procession, when you look at mumming, obviously there's a strong folkloric concept or folk tradition concept of the European peoples, and you really can't escape the traditions of the Fae.
Very true. Well, and just that's shown in the Wild Hunt itself, that the Fae was very prominent. So it goes back a long ways. We often, I think, people now just associate the Fae with more modern fiction and fantasy, but these ideas go back time immemorial, really, in Northern Europe.
They do, and there's various aspects. The one that I really like landing on, although there's some really fascinating components to all of it, is the buttery sprite.
Yes.
Now, I just as a quick aside, on the Isle of Wight, this is in a reference to the fact that in some cases British fairies are very cautionary. Don't go here and do this because the fairies will get you.
Exactly.
And you could say, you could just sort of throw that out there, but in many cases in the folklore, it is wildly specific. And some of them are better known than others. The Fae that live in ponds and threaten to drown incautious children. They're associated with pondweed. Lancashire and Cumbria has Ginny Greenteeth. Yorkshire has the Grindylows. Of course, Hogwarts also has the Grindylows. There's East Anglia has freshwater mermaids, so on and so forth. However, just this short note that in the fruit bushes of the Isle of Wight, the gooseberry wife awaits wayward children. She is a huge fairy caterpillar.
That's frightening when you think about it.
That's actually, I think that is the most terrifying fae that I have yet encountered.
That may well be.
Beware the gooseberry wife. And but more specifically, the buttery sprites are protective fae, essentially house elves guarding the cellars and the butteries, the pantries of the larger pantries of various locations. And not only, and this is particularly interesting, not only are the fae told to frighten children, but there's also a lot of fairy stories being told to frighten the servants.
That's true, to encourage them to be diligent in their work. And then the flip side is that buttery sprites and other sort of household fae could spoil food and things like that if they were displeased.
Yes, and the idea, of course, that is that the buttery sprites, they are potentially mischievous, highly protective, non-corporeal entities that haunt, but are not exactly ghosts. They're inhuman.
Right.
They never were human, but they will haunt the butteries, the big food sellers, and protect them, frighten away thieving servants, punish the indigent, and presumably they consume cream.
Which again goes back to leaving out milk for Santa Claus.
Yes.
Or eggnog traditionally. Yes. I also like the fact that storerooms in places were guarded by bloody bones.
I do too. And there's a collected folk tale that does associate a form of that story with an Ozarks potato cellar.
Yes.
And cellar as in pantry basement, not cellar as in someone selling potatoes.
I don't know it in detail, but I've heard it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's blood involved. There's a lot of blood involved. It's a little disconcerting. And there's some deep,
it's bloody bones,
Yes, there's some deep metaphorical or allegorical content, subtext with it, and involves it really just a lot of terrifying archetypal elements. Little girl sent by her parents down into the cellar to collect the potatoes, and there's a figure composed of blood that is forming itself out of the cellar floor, and it has a variety of things to tell her, and no one in the family will believe that she's actually having experience. They think that she's just making up stories.
Right. Well, and that kind of tale has various variations that change, get a little further away from sort of that, storeroom or cellar, etc., but still are based on something sort of preying upon someone and then not being believed. And and some people would say, well, why are we talking about these things when we're talking about Yule and so on and so forth? But this time of year is the most important time of the year to be able to preserve food traditionally. So, your buttery sprites and your other fae that basically affect your ability to weather the winter play a part in this, because it is the dark time of winter, and staying on the right side of the fae helps you survive.
It does. And again, from the the larger solar calendar, from Halloween, essentially in modern calendars, from Halloween to Groundhog's Day is the darkest time of the year. It is literally the darkest time of the year, culminating with the solstice, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. And we are dealing with a time in which spectral entities were thought to be at their most powerful, and for mortals, we were at our most vulnerable.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of, oh, go ahead.
No,
I kind of lost my train of thought anyway.
No, of course. I think just along that line, and there's a strong Ozarkian motif to this as well, which is the supernatural black dogs.
Yes. Which, I mean, we've kind of alluded to a little bit of the Wild Hunt that they figured there as well, but spectral animals, particularly hams, tend to be associated with the dark time of the year, the winter, barren times, often omens of death or bad tidings, bad luck.
Right. And sometimes headless.
Yes, sometimes headless. And particularly if headless, more of definitely a death omen.
Yeah. And there's something about the black dog lore that is particularly associated with English folk tradition, more so than Germanic, and certainly more so than other areas of Europe, but is definitely, undoubtedly, of English origin, which really makes me wonder. I'm purely conjecturing here. Really makes me wonder if there wasn't an Anglo-Saxon base, a death god associated with dogs in Anglo-Saxon mythology. And we see we see certain aspects and elements that are in other, are in Celtic and are in Germanic, they are in Norse, they are in Greek with Cerberus, but not to the just the pervasiveness of the lore that we see specifically in Old English.
That's true. That is true. And sometimes they're seen more as just sort of neutral as far as good or bad. They just are an omen of what is to be. Sometimes they are associated with the underworld or the devil. I think in more modern times, they tend to be associated as hellhounds, etc. But that's certainly not universal. And in some instances, they're described as part of the fae.
Right. And if you are describing them as part of the fae, in the Irish tradition, we would be dealing with beings of the unseelie court.
Exactly.
The Old English skuka or skaka, we get the word shuck, which means anyway, it means devil or fiend. And the term old shuck or black shuck is synonymous with both the black dog as well at times as the devil. I'm particularly interested in the Manx legend, the Isle of Man, of the black dog called the Madidu, or the Mothadoo, and I just like to say that. Plus, it sounds like Scooby Doo, the Madidu, and, but the black dog haunts deserted places like lanes or fields in the dead of night. Their howls presage the death of anyone unfortunate enough to meet them. The F-hound of Devon is said to be a spirit of an unbaptized child that rambles through the woods at night making wailing noises. Like, that's not terrifying.
And it's headless.
And it is headless, just like the good old booger dog from the Ozarks.
Yeah.
And may have been the inspiration of the ghost dog in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of Baskerville.
Quite the pedigree.
Really is. He's definitely AKC registered. It's just potentially hard to put the collar on because he doesn't have a head.
That's true. more of a challenge there. There's the whist hounds. I like the whist hounds.
I'm a big fan of the whist hounds. Again, associated with southern Devon. Oh,
and associated with the huntsman as well.
Associated with the huntsman, associated with the devil, associated with the ghost of Sir Francis Drake.
Yes, especially that Drake would drive a black hearse coach on the road between Tavistock and Plymouth at night, drawn by headless horses and accompanied by demons and a pack of headless hounds.
There's a lot of headlessness.
Yes. And then it's also a term for weird sorrow with mysterious causes.
Yes.
Which I find interesting.
I do too. I think that's one of my big takeaways from tonight's episode for me, myself.
Mm-hmm.
There is something that I can't help as we go over the witch towns, the ghostly or haunted hounds of Devon. Something that I can't help but take away from this is layers of complex meaning beyond just ghost.
Exactly. That's just part of it, but not all. I mean, and then this lore, although very British in origin, has really found a home in North America as well.
It has. Now we have several comparatively modern accounts of black spectral dogs causing trouble, but the concept of the booger dog, which we hopefully will have time, is not dissimilar to the Coochie of Scotland, but definitely has a home in Ozarkian folklore, but is not limited to the Ozarks, and I find that really fascinating. We have a black dog tale from southeastern Massachusetts from the 1970s. The town of Abingdon being reportedly terrorized by a large black dog. Local firemen saw it attacking horses. Local police unsuccessfully searched for it. Eventually, a police officer sighted the dog walking along train tracks and shot at it, but bullets had no effect on the animal.
That's definitely interesting, and not that long ago when you think about it.
Not at all.
And then there's a growing lore with long haul truck drivers of black dogs with red eyes, seeing them particularly in peripheral vision as a sign of a fatal crash being imminent, and that you should stop and pull off the road. We've actually had people bring that to us, through Dark Ozarks with those stories. It is a modern folklore tale that some truckers take pretty seriously.
And now we're moving more into the realm of individuals actually bringing reports to you, correct?
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think that I think a lot, some of them come across very much as they've had this experience, or someone they knew had this experience, and they do not associate it with like longstanding folklore or anything. They just associate it with, this is what was seen, then there was not a dog there. There's also, tale close to us with the spook light of a black dog being hit by cars repeatedly.
Right, but there's no dog after.
But there's no dog, can't find any dog, and then seeing the same dog, another point in time and hitting it again. It's the same dog. And these stories don't seem to be rooted in the lore of the Black Hound. It's not that hearing the Black Hound stories affected the current experiences. Right.
To me, that is because I have these in my notes, but I've not talked to someone about the long haul truck drivers lore.
Right. I've known several people who've had those kind of experiences, or related that someone they knew close to them told them this story. And then there is one that has been publicized a bit. It's probably 15, 20 years old now, that happened out west. I want to say in Utah. But I'd have to look and check where it happened. On a lonely highway, only truck out there, and seeing a black dog running along aside the road, but it's keeping up with the truck. And finally he stops and pulls over, because he's beginning to think maybe he's getting too tired and he's hallucinating, only to find out that there was a major wreck ahead, and that if he hadn't stopped, he'd probably been in the middle of it.
And here we have the dogs seen as warnings.
And that's true. Even in the British tradition, there are times that the spectral hounds or spectral animals were warnings to keep you away from danger as well. And
something that seems to be very consistent is the idea that when an individual sees this animal, there's something in the back of their head that signals this isn't just another animal.
Right, that there is something to it, that there is a meaning to it, and to really pay attention to what message is being conveyed.
It is. And in the time, our as we move forward into December, I have a suspicion that our dark Yule lore is in association with the Ozarks, as well as with the Ozarks European traditions, is going to continue for a couple more episodes, because there's a lot of material to cover that is so easily overlooked, because we are largely blinded by commercial Christmas.
Yeah. It's the shiny bauble effect.
It was so shiny I couldn't help myself. But then, then I found my horse skull, and it all came into focus. But I do think that we have time just to talk a little bit about the Kushi, the spectral dogs of Scotland. And this is to me of particular interest because in so many cases we see that Scots traditions are also Ozarks traditions.
Very true. Very, very true.
And the Kushi, for people who don't know, it's spelled CU and then dash or space and then SITH. In English, it would be pronounced Sith. And in case you were wondering, yes, George Lucas did take the Scottish word for fairy, take off the Scots Gaelic pronunciation, put an American pronunciation on it to arrive at his word for the Dark Jedi, meaning the Sith.
Yeah.
But in Scots Gaelic, in Scottish, it is not pronounced Sith. It is pronounced she, which is nearly identical to the Irish Gaelic she, which is spelled in English SIDHE. So there you go. But specifically, the Kushi was a spectral dog found in the mythology of Scotland and Hebrides. The name comes from Scottish Gaelic. Interestingly enough, I may have to retract something that I said, because obviously we do have spectral hounds in Scottish, Welsh, and Irish lore, in addition to Anglo-Saxon. So there you go.
Sure.
I may be completely wrong about what I said earlier about it being associated with the Anglo-Saxons.
Well, there seems to be a strong presence of the lore in the British Isles generally. We'll say that.
That is true. And I do find it interesting that it was not known to have a black coat, right,
but a dark green coat.
Yes, and Kushi translates to fairy dog.
Yes, and but then green was traditionally associated with the fairy realm, so that's probably why it would be seen that way. And probably at night, you'd probably still think it was black anyway. So
the Kushi's eyes are large and have a fiery glow. Its tail is long and curled, and sometimes it was braided. It was said to have paws the size of a man's hand. The beast was said to roam the wild moors and highlands, making its lair in rocky clefts and crevices. Some interesting takeaways in terms of that. One, something that we see just as a reference to next week's episode, potentially, of cryptids, is certain cryptids seem to be noted by having abnormally long tails.
Some are, that's true.
Not all.
No.
Not Bigfoot, but I did think that was interesting. The paws the size of a man's hand. There are dogs who have paws the size of a man's hand, but a notable takeaway on this is the immediate recognition that we're dealing with an abnormally large animal.
Yes, larger than typical dog is what they're describing, and it was an omen of death. That it would appear at the time of death, kind of like the Grim Reaper, and that it would take the soul to the fairy realm, or the
which, depending upon one's propensity, one might not, especially in Christian Europe, one might not want their soul taken to the fairy realm. One might want their body buried in a consecrated graveyard with their soul going to heaven, as opposed to being taken up to the fairy realm. So there is the potentiality of threat, but additionally, if you're resistant to the church, you might want your soul taken to the other world by
That's
the
true.
Kushi. So
That's
again,
true.
duality. I find this really interesting. The hound is said to have hunted silently for its victims, but would sometimes rend the air with 3 blood-curdling yowls that carried for a great distance and even far over the sea.
And you would have to try to find a place of safety by the 3rd howl, or you might die of fear.
And there is a strong element of Northern European fate associated with this idea. I find even far out to sea, the idea that if you're for example, if you're being hunted by the Kushi, getting on a ship and sailing away is not going to fix it.
That's true. Yeah. Running from your problem is not always the answer.
No, rarely is it the answer.
Also, the association of with women and babies, particularly nursing women, that they would lock them up for fear that they would be taken to the fairy realm.
Where they'd be made to give up their breast milk to feed the children of the Dane Shi, or the fairies, who are often believed to be the forefathers of the gods and the goddesses of nature. And we do again find this idea, which I think has a lot of potential value, that mortals, on the comparatively rare occasions in which they interact with the Fae, are at the Fae's mercy.
Yes. It's very much like the jinn, that you can make deals with the jinn, but you must be very careful because you will get what you ask for. It's that there is a risk when you deal with these other worldly beings.
Yes, if you are either brave enough or foolhardy enough to engage,
exactly,
that there's the danger of penalty. And I think that there's a really important takeaway, perhaps conclusion, for tonight's episode. The takeaway being of risk and reward, in the sense that we live in a world in which we're blinded by the idea that everything has a childproof safety cap and insurance covers everything. And no matter what, life doesn't actually work that way. And in order to actually function, to seek reward, to succeed, for lack of a better term, is that you have to take genuine risk. And increasingly, it's easy to encounter individuals who have this perspective that somehow they can go through life with all reward and, under the correct circumstances, have zero risk.
I think it is a modern fairy tale in itself that people really do seem to believe that.
And interestingly enough, I think that may be the real fiction, the real fairy tale. I think there's a great deal of truth contained within our traditional quote unquote fairy tales. We look at these stories of encounters with the Fae, and we might laugh at the foolhardiness of the protagonist, of the hero, for daring to tempt fate, to tempt the fairies, to tempt the other world, to that might even seem hubristic on our part. And yet, I think in a larger sense, perhaps an allegorical sense of fiction imitating life, there is an interesting story. So many of our focus, the focus that we have on stories is, and I'm doing my brain is doing a unique inversion on this, because so much of fairy lore is associated with cautionary tales. Don't go, if you're a child, don't go play in the pond and drown, because
Right.
Jenny Greenteeth is gonna eat you, that kind of thing, drag you underwater at least, and so on and so forth. So we typically see the fae from a standpoint of caution. But what if we invert that for a moment and look at it in this perhaps allegorical standpoint, saying essentially, with great risk comes great reward. If you are going to live life, you have to accept that there are dangers, that there are pitfalls, that there are things waiting to trip you up, things waiting to trick you, things waiting to put you in danger. And you can either, stay home and stare out your window the rest of your days, or you can go out and engage.
Oh, I agree. And life is more fulfilling when you do.
And
now,
yeah, go ahead.
I know you kind of intimated perhaps ending there. I do want to just talk very briefly about the cat she.
Yes.
Because it does tie, part of this does tie to common lore in the Ozarks.
Very much so. The ghost cat or the fairy cat.
Yes. And again, from Scottish lore, and often viewed as malevolent, not only just death omen, but benevolent. They are generally all black, sometimes a white spot on their chest, and haunt the Highlands is where it originated. Again, it's supposed to be big, close to the size of a large dog. Perhaps the source of Black Panthers.
Yeah. Here we go.
But then there's theories that they aren't fairies, that they are witches, and can transform between human form and cat form, but can only be done 9 times. And the 9th transformation into a cat is permanent, which is the source of the old adage that a cat has 9 lives. But they are considered malevolent creatures or spirits because they were believed to be thieves of souls, that they would pass over the corpse of a body prior to a burial and steal the soul before the gods could claim it. They would set up watches to guard the dead, so that that cannot happen. But this is also sort of the source of the very common lore of cats stealing the souls of babies.
Yes.
And very common belief that you should never let a cat near the cradle of a baby. And it would often be espoused. I've heard this, my grandmothers and their friends talking, and never let a cat lick the baby's face for stealing the soul. And looking at it practically, typically what it would be is you would have a baby who'd been nursing, taking a bottle, have milk on its lips, and the cat would lick the milk. But that, I believe, is the source of those tales that are still believed in some parts in the Ozarks of why you should never let a cat near a baby.
Yes. And in these, the lore associated with the cat she and the lore associated in Scotland and the lore associated with the booger cat or the witch cat in the Ozarks is nearly identical.
It is. And well, and of course, just because a lot of the settlers came from that tradition. So
They did. And the isolation that many of the settlers experienced after having come over meant that those traditions were maintained and survived well into the 20th century, where in other places the culture would have become more diffuse.
right. And now some of those superstitions persist, although now they are in some places divorced from the original lore.
Right. And of course there's just that sense of foreboding about having cats around the dead.
Exactly. So you don't want cats around the newly born or the dead.
And or and I think in the case of the newly born, the sense that these are vulnerable, the vulnerable. Yeah. And now, just as an aside, after all of our witnessing of online arguments about whether or not Black Panthers exist, now I'm just wondering, what if all of the accounts is actually just a cat she appearing, and no, Black Panthers don't exist, but spectral witch cats do.
You're gonna get us hate mail.
I'll be hiding behind my horse's skull.
First you will.
It'll deflect the hate mail.
Oh, well, that being said, perhaps that's a good place to end tonight, and we can pick up more of this Yule lore later in a month.
Yes.
Don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. And thank you again to Always Fine Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing cryptids and creatures, specifically lore versus science. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. And thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.